Welcome to Teacher Training Unplugged Radio. This is Anthony Gaughan. Well, I hope you've all had a restful weekend in amongst all of the feverish work you've probably been doing. And this is going to be quite a short podcast. I'd really only like to address one point, which is practice, more particularly controlled practice, and even more specifically, how to avoid designing or selecting controlled practice that tells you nothing about the student's understanding, even when they've completed the task successfully. So let's get started. Practice makes perfect, they say, and you'd think that any kind of practice is beneficial, and that may be true in a very broad sense, but very often practice that is given to students doesn't do the job quite that the teacher hopes it does or thinks it will. I'll give you a concrete example of what I mean. There's a fairly common practice task that I see a lot where teachers ask their students after a language presentation to simply write 5 sentences in the target structure. For example, if the lesson was a past simple lesson, the teacher would say, okay, now write 5 sentences in the past simple. Using the verbs maybe on the board or just make up your own. What frequently happens is the teachers tell the students to do this and the students perform this perfectly well. They write 5 sentences, they're in the past simple, and they're well-formed sentences. Things like, I worked yesterday, he was in school, that kind of thing. Now, they're well formed in the sense that they conform to the basic grammar of the past simple. But if you looked at those sentences carefully, you'd see that we cannot know by reading them whether or not what they say is true. And this is a problem because to know whether or not the past simple has been used appropriately, we have to know whether what is being said is true. So, to take the first example, I worked yesterday. To make sure that that is an appropriate use of the past simple, we'd have to find out from the person who wrote it whether they did in fact work yesterday. It may be that they've just invented the sentence as a demonstration of grammatical control. Now that has some value, but it's obviously not as good as them having written something that is well formed and well said. So, how can we avoid this? Well, the first thing we can do is not simply ask students to write 5 sentences in the past simple, or indeed to complete any activity where it's a simple, formal decision that they have to make, but to ask them to produce utterances which are true, or at least verifiable. So, in the 5 sentences example, you'd simply say, okay, write 5 sentences about your day yesterday that are true. Yeah? And then those can be checked. Or, if this were a gap fill from a course book, for example, we would look to the examples and check whether there was adequate context within the gapped sentences to make it necessary to form a sentence in a certain way, whether that be positive or negative or in the past or in the present perfect, for example. Now, last week I saw this idea taken slightly further by one of your colleagues on the course, and it was very good to see. She created a gap fill, and the gap fill was a series of sentences practicing a certain grammatical structure. And what was interesting was all of the subjects in these sentences were the actual students in the group. She'd selected each student's name and created some kind of a sentence about them. And what was very interesting about this was she wasn't just using their names, but she was basing the content of each sentence on what she knew about them. what they had shared in class with each other, about their private lives, about their work lives. And so the content was absolutely verifiable. And it was also, by the way, completely engaging. As soon as the students started reading the task and they spotted their colleagues' names, or at the very latest their own, you could see the amusement and the appreciation that they felt while they tried to work out not only how grammatically to complete these answers, but also trying to think about what was in fact true. That made the task much more valuable, it seems to me, and, by the way, much easier to check, and to check more usefully. So, just to reiterate those tips, if you're going to get students to write paradigm examples of grammar, then do yourself a favour and make sure that they're verifiable. At the very simplest, you can ask them to simply state things that are true or factual. Or when you design tasks or select tasks from another source, you can ask yourself, is there enough context in the examples themselves to require a given structure? And where there's ambiguity, where there's insufficient context, can I provide it? Can I add it to what's on the page? So that the students are not simply making mechanical, formal decisions about grammar, but just trying to connect it to meaningful communication. Okay, well, that's all I have to say this week. Short and sweet, so probably by the time you've listened to this, the kettle's boiled. You can make yourself a cup of tea, sit down, and carry on with all the work you have for next week. Until Monday, this is Anthony Gaughan for Teacher Training Unplugged Radio. Bye for now.